Hello and welcome. Thank you for tuning in to this video blog about Nixon and the environment, as the Nixon administration and environmental policies, more specifically dealing with the Clean Air Act. Now, in the decades that followed World War II, the United States became the most prosperous nation in the world. Yet that prosperity and growth had a negative impact on the environmental quality of the nation. By the mid 1960s, there was a rise in concern over environmental issues in the American public. When Nixon was elected president in 1969, he was determined to give the American people what they sought and decided to enact controversial policies to bring the environmental crisis to an end. Be mindful that Nixon was a Republican president, yet he was very strong, very committed to ending the environmental crisis that followed the economic boom in the post-war period. Now, the Nixon administration is one of the most environmentally active presidencies in American history. Among the environmental policies of the Nixon administration was the Clean Air Act of 1970, a highly controversial piece of legislation that placed tough regulations on the automobile industry. Due to the significant role of the auto industry in the American economy, at a time of high inflation, there were significant crashes between this industry and the United States government. Now, as far as the historiography, historically oriented scholarship on the environmental policies of the Nixon administration has been centered around two areas, or two specific questions, really. Who should get the credit for the environmental policies of this era? That's one of them. And the second one, Nixon's authenticity. Was he really an environmentalist? Was he a true environmentalist? Or was he just doing all of this because he was a political pragmatist? Now, Charles Warren credited Nixon for environmental progress in America, particularly during his first term. Michael Genovese, another historian, found Nixon politically right-wing and pro-industry, and he credited Congress for environmental leadership. Michael Kraft attributed environmental progress to an extraordinary group of policy entrepreneurs on Capitol Hill. Once again, Congress, not really the president. Jacqueline V. Switzer argues that Nixon initially opposed the environmental initiatives, but eventually succumbed to increasing public pressure and instructed his staff to rush through this environmental legislation. Now, in terms of the primary evidence, there's evidence from multiple sides, but one of them is John Ehrlichman. John Ehrlichman was assistant to the president on domestic affairs. Nixon, he says, always liked foreign policy and was not passionate about domestic affairs, which in many cases were delegated to others. The environment was one of them. Nixon, and this is a quote from Ehrlichman, Nixon insisted that I don't bother him about many areas. The environment was one of them. Although Nixon's main area of interest was foreign policy, political expediency really forced him to remain very active in the areas of domestic affairs. Now, another primary source was John Whitaker, who served at the White House and the Department of Interior during the environmental crisis. Nixon was not interested in environmental issues during his first year as president, Whitaker argues. He feared a potential backlash effect in the form of fewer jobs, slower economic growth, and higher prices. Nixon's approach changed once Nixon realized that he needed to take the lead against environmental degradation for the good of the country and the popularity of the administration. Now, the economic impact of the Clean Air Act. In 1968, President Nixon appointed a transition task force, and one of them, multiple transition task forces, but one of them was a task force on natural resources and the environment. On December 5th, 1968, this task force wrote a report on and presented it to Nixon. The report stated that the country was facing an environmental crisis that could negatively affect the health, the standard of living, and the economy overall of the American people. On February 10, 1970, in a special message to Congress on environmental quality, Nixon outlined a comprehensive 37-point program embracing 23 major legislative proposals and 14 new measures. Among them was the controversial Clean Air Act. The economic impact of the Clean Air Act. In November 1970, Senator Edmund Muskie proposed that automobile emissions of carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and nitrogen oxides be reduced by 90% by 1975. The auto companies, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, obviously responded by trying to alter the course or the requirements presented in this legislation. They met with Nixon and argued that the technology was not available to meet the 1975 deadline. Nixon sent to Congress his version of the bill, which asked for a revision of Muskie's proposal and claimed that the deadline to meet the reduction in emission standards should be 1980 and not 1975. The president was willing to enact tough regulations on businesses, yet he also sought to provide them with leeway to adapt without a loss of profits and jobs. Nixon was aware that a healthy and prosperous private sector increased the chances for his electoral success. Nixon was neither a passionate environmentalist nor a pro-business president. Nixon did not blame industry or progress for the damage of the environment. In a special message to Congress, he said, "There is no villain in this environmental problem. It comes not from decisions taken, but from decisions neglected. Not from malign intention, but from failure to take into account the full consequences of our actions." There was research done for this study in the form of primary and secondary sources. Thank you for listening, and have a great end of the year. Bye-bye.